Welcome. We're so glad you're able to join us for Encountering Augustine Through His Letters. My name is Greg Metzger, part of the team at New City Press. Today's is the third program we have done on Augustine's writings. A year ago, we hosted Reading Augustine in a Time of Crisis, which had a special focus on City of God. In June, we hosted Preaching the Gospel of John with St. Augustine, which looked at Augustine's homiletical works. And now today, we're happy to turn to his letters. New City Press has worked with a number of great organizations on these three events, but each time one of those partners has been the Augustinian Institute at Villanova University. The director of the Augustinian Institute, James Wetzel, is with us again today, and I'm happy to turn things over to him now for his leadership and guidance for today's session. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here representing the Augustinian Institute. It's also a pleasure to be with our friends and partners at New City Press and the Augustine Heritage Institute. I'm also really thrilled also to be sharing today's webinar with two of my good friends, James K.A. Smith, sometimes also known as Jamie, who's a professor of philosophy at Calvin College, where he holds an endowed chair in applied Reformed theology and worldview, author of many very readable and insightful books. One of the most recent is On the Road with St. Augustine, A Real-World Spirituality for Restless Hearts. And I'm also happy to be here with my friend Sarah Stewart-Kroeker, who is on the Faculty of Theology at the University of Geneva, where she teaches theological ethics. Sarah and I go way back to her Princeton days when she was getting her PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. Let me give you just a quick sense of what we're going to do. I'm going to say a few words about the volume on the essential letters that has just come out with New City Press. And then Sarah and Jamie and I are going to take turns saying a couple of words about letters that we personally find particularly interesting. And we'll probably go Sarah, Jamie, and then me. But after we each say something about the letters of interest, we may comment on each other's letters and see how it goes. After that, I'm going to introduce my colleague at the Augustinian Institute, Ian Claussen, who will say something about a project that's almost ready to launch, the Augustine blog, which is a joint venture between the Augustinian Institute and New City Press. And then we'll have some time, I think, to take a couple of questions and answers from you, and then we'll wrap it up. So let me begin just by saying a couple of words about this volume that just came out, the Essential Letters. Mainly, I'm going to be highlighting just a few points from the very skillful introduction written by Przemysław Naring. Dr. Naring, I don't think he could make it here for this particular session, but he knows what's going on. And if he sees the recording, I want to give a shout out to him. He did an amazing job writing the introduction and making the selection of the letters and putting together a really huge, a very intelligent selection of a huge body of letters. Dr. Naring is a classicist on the Faculty of the Humanities at Nicholas Copernicus University in Torun, Poland. He's also vice rector for the School of Education. I'm not going to repeat much of the details of his really masterful introduction because it would take way too long, but I want to give you some of the highlights. He makes the point that the broad context of Augustine's letter writing is within two large epistolary traditions, one broadly ancient, and the other one really having to do with early Christian Latin letters. I'm not going to say too much about the details there. I just want to make three obvious points. Sometimes obvious is good. One is that what makes a piece of writing a letter is basically that there is an addressee. From there, it gets more complicated because how one manages to do a proper address to a correspondent depends on lots of things. I think a very basic distinction is there a hierarchical relationship between the letter writer and the addressee? Or is there a presumption of equality? Or is there some suspension of the difference between these two kinds of things? We can learn a lot about the complexities of Augustine's social world just by looking at how he writes letters. The third thing I wanted to point out is that, again, a sort of an obvious point about our contemporary life, we're not much of a culture of letter writing any longer. We have emails and Instagrams and that kind of thing, and that's not very, they're tricky to compose, I have to say. So maybe they're kind of a remnants or a shadow of an epistolary tradition, but they're not quite the same thing. Well, my point is getting into the world of the letters is really like getting into a world that's both strange and in places familiar, but largely, I think, gives you a setting that you don't normally get from a culture where letter writing isn't valued as much. Just a couple of things about what Dr. Narin managed to put together. There's a large amount of letters that are available to us that have to do with a correspondence with Augustine. 309 totals thus far, 252 from him, 49 to him, 8 neither specified by addressee or addressor, but scholars seem confident that they are letters to or from Augustine. The latest big infusion to the inventory was in 1981 when the Austrian, very different than Australian, the Austrian philologist Johannes Divjak found and published and edited 31 newly discovered original letters that he discovered in libraries in Spain and France. How many letters might still be out there is anybody's guess. Professor Naring says, maybe as little as half of the collection is still there to be discovered, maybe as much as 7/8. Even given what we have now, it's a stunning amount of letters. And Augustine couldn't have needed help just in terms of the mechanics of getting them out. And so the letters are dictated. I can't imagine being a scribe in his area. It must have been really a great deal of work. And it's also important to have a reliable messenger who could be counted on to relay the message. The volume, this is a large collection of letters, and the usual way of organizing them, going back to the 17th century Benedictines, who were the first to do a critical edition of the letters, is to do it chronologically. But that's a little bit tricky given the fact that Augustine never dates his letters. But what we do know that the temporal scope of the letters covers roughly the period from 386 to 387, where he's in Milan, and this is the time of his conversion, to 430, and this is the year of his death, where he is a bishop in the see of Hippo Regius, and a Vandal fleet is blockading the city and preparing to invade. Dr. Narin has decided to organize his selection of the letters thematically while preserving chronology in the thematic groupings. And he follows Father Roland Teskey of blessed memory, who did the translation of the letters and much else. In fact, I think Roland is arguably the most important translator of Augustine in the 20th century. In an essay that, in a collection of his essays that Roland put together, he divided his study of Augustine into 3 categories. And Dr. Naring takes over this 3-part division and then adds 2 things. So it's Augustine the philosopher, Augustine the theologian, and Augustine the exegete, which are 3 of the groupings of the letters we have in the essential letters. And then Dr. Naring adds Augustine as bishop and Augustine as monk and monastic founder. And I want to conclude these opening remarks on just how the volume is organized with a fun fact. And the fun fact is that, with the exception to a letter to someone named Severinus, who is a relative of Augustine's of some sort, we don't have letters that Augustine wrote to family members. I mean, it would be lovely if we could know more about Navigius, his brother, or his sister, who, her death is alluded to in one of the letters, but we never get her name, or we never get any correspondence between her and Augustine. Dr. Namey points that doesn't mean he didn't write the letters. It may say something more about the politics of their manner of transition as a collection, but I still think it's striking, and I have to say a little bit disappointing that we don't have some more of the personal letters between him and his family members. Okay, that's all I have to say by way of, I hope was a fairly succinct, I think it was, introduction to the volume. Now we're going to go to the part where each of us talks a bit about some of the letters that we would want to point out. And Sarah, if it's okay to start with you, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Jim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Augustine's letters to women, which there are a few included in this volume. And I will focus particularly on two of them. So I'll just to let you know the four letters that are included. One is a letter to Juliana, who is the daughter of Demetrius, and both of these women belong to a very wealthy and aristocratic family that were part of the Roman elite and converted to Christianity. Demetrius, the context of the letters, that Demetrius has decided to become a consecrated virgin, and Augustine writes to Juliana, her mother, after having learned that Pelagius has apparently, upon request, written a letter to Demetrius on virginity. And so, as we'll see, the letter actually falls into the sort of anti-Pelagian literature that Jamie will also talk about. But it's an interesting part of the interest of this letter is that Demetrius is written to, or in Augustine's case, about by three theologians of the time, beyond Augustine, obviously Pelagius, and also Jerome. So her decision to take this vow of virginity is obviously of great interest, which no doubt reflects her social and economic standing within a context of also doctrinal controversies. So that's one of the letters that I'll be talking about. There's another letter that we have to Fabiola in the collection, which details a very scandalous and horrible series of events tied to Antoninus. I won't talk much about that letter, but it does give a kind of window into the serious dysfunctions that Augustine had to concern himself with as the bishop, and his distress over the ways in which this affects his relationship with this community, and also the church's sort of standing, social standing and reputation. And it's interesting that he writes to Fabiola, a lay woman who he obviously esteems to have some influence, detailing this this whole affair. And so it's perhaps interesting simply to note that that he did concern himself with women of standing in these ways, and consider them to have, I mean, in a context where women obviously did not have the kind of authority that men did, they nevertheless were addressed on matters of concern of this sort as well. And then the other two letters, one of them is to the Felicity, who is the superior of this female monastic order. She's replaced Augustine's sister, who has died, and is obviously having some difficulty. So we get that initial letter from Augustine to Felicity, and then we have a second letter which is addressed to the nuns, and which includes an adapted rule, monastic rule, for the nuns, which which is of interest, given that these were, I mean, monastic communities are just being established in the area at the time, and certainly the rule for women is less established. I think it may be the first. I'm not a historian, so don't query me too closely about all of the historical details. Anyway, in the context of,
I think it is the
that,
first, Sarah.
I think it is the first.
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. I thought so, and I was second guessing. So I'll get into some of the complexities of that rule when I talk about that letter. But I'll start with the letter to Juliana about Demetrius. So there are various interesting features of this letter. I mean, part of the interest of looking at Augustine's letters to women is that I mean, Augustine is often really seriously criticized for the devastating legacy he would have left the tradition of Western thought on sex and on women, within that sex, sexuality, women, and his writing, not just sort of about women that we do get, for example, in the Confessions, as he writes about his mother Monica, or about his unnamed love. In the letters, we actually see him address women, and so it gives us some insight, some further insight into what those relationships might look like, and to what extent, or at least in the epistolary form, and not just his account of, although we only have his address. So one of the things that is of note is that he writes the letter to Juliana, not directly to Demetrius. I don't know why this is, but it does sort of reinforce, I mean, it does reinforce a kind of Demetrius as the object of this theological attention, while in this case in particular, it's sort of indirectly indirectly addressed to her, because it is addressed to Juliana, and it's obviously, I mean, because of the way in which it's responding to the fact that they've received this this book from Pelagius to Demetrius, does suggest that perhaps he's worried about Juliana's relationship with Pelagius, and to him and Alypius, who's sort of the co-address. It is sent from Alypius and Augustine together, whether he is addressing it to Juliana because of the role that he surmises her to have, and deems that she must be swayed from Pelagius's influence if Demetrius too will be. But there's the significance of the contest with Pelagius is very explicit. So we see him sort of pick out these points from Pelagius's text and respond, and there's clearly an insecurity at play in terms of whose theological vision will win out. And in an interesting sense, it's less a letter about virginity per se than about the matter of asceticism and grace. And So the role that one attributes to one's own will in undertaking an aesthetic path that such as Demetrius has, which is not because Augustine was unconcerned with questions about virginity and sex, but his primary concern does really seem, I mean, one of the object of his concern in this letter very clearly has to do with a worry that Demetrius might sort of take pride in this in this vow and in its practice in a way that would open her up to a sort of a failure to be grateful to God for the gifts of virtue on which, for Augustine, we all depend. But it is quite striking to me that in this letter, and Jerome doesn't appear directly in this, it's Augustine and Pelagius are the two theologians who are sort of explicitly involved in this contest in this letter, but we do have this kind of contest, theological contest over a young woman's virginal body that in this case is really sort of taking place without in the case of this letter is really taking place without any direct involvement or address to her herself. Furthermore, we can look at the ways in which there's a kind of idealization of her as this feminine archetype, the beautiful bride of the handsome Christ, which in light of her silence and the indirect form of address, I think just highlights a certain kind of textual objectification of her. And but one of the interesting things about one of the other interesting things about this letter is that as much as it is deeply anti-Pelagian, explicitly so, in his emphasis on grace and the gratitude that we owe to God for any gifts of will and virtue that we might have. And although Augustine has elsewhere been sort of praised for his moderation on matters of asceticism, particularly in relation to sex, so his doctrine of marriage is a little less disparaging than others at the time. He certainly does not. He also plays into it in a way that I think is really quite striking when he talks about Juliana being surpassed by her daughter. This is actually, I'll just read this passage because I think it's there is I think a kind of indirect exhortation to humility on Juliana's part as well, where he says, "So from this source then holy virginity also comes, in which you are willing and glad to be surpassed by your daughter, after you by birth, before you by action, from you by generation, ahead of you in honor, coming after you in age, going before you in holiness. In her that begins to be yours, which could not be in you. She has not married in terms of the flesh, so that beyond you, she might be made spiritually greater, not only for herself, but also for you." So on the one hand, I think it's interesting to see the tension between Augustine's emphasis on grace and in the broader context, some of the ways in which he's working against a kind of virtuous elite that would put the ascetics so far beyond the weaker willed who resort to marriage. But he also very clearly retains aspects of the hierarchy, of the moral hierarchy, and perhaps part of this is an exhortation to Juliana, to a kind of humility herself. But I was there. I think that tension is sort of on display in this letter in some interesting ways. So I will move now on to the second letter. I hope I'm not taking too long. Okay. And I'm doing this very conversationally, as that's the that's the mode we're hoping to have for this.
Great letter.
The letter to the nuns. So one of the things that's interesting about the letter to Felicity that I'll just flag, because it relates to some of what I'm interested in the letter to the nuns, which is I'm very interested in the affective and emotional registers that he employs in these. And so already in the letter to Felicity, he which is very brief, but he mentions sort of the danger of anger in particular, and the way that anger can ruin a heart, and so already there's a context for the strife that he will be then addressing sort of collectively to the nuns, but which he's obviously aware of the Augustine in many of his writings, and especially in both the letters and in some of the letters, but also in his sermons, displays quite a lot of attention to the emotional life. And so we see his concern about Felicity's anger, or the difficulty, the bitterness that she may be experiencing in response to the nuns' dissatisfaction with her rule. And when he opens the letter to the nuns subsequently, it's a very charged, emotionally charged opening. So he talks about, the initial move is already a kind of, one of them is before he gets into some of the more emotional aspects of the letter. There's a kind of shaming move where he says, "I haven't come to see you because I might find you to be the sort of persons I do not want you to be." So there's this kind of very, to be fair, he says, "and you might find me to be the sort of person you did not want me to be." Although presumably that's more because he is giving them corrections that they may not want to hear, and yet that he deems obviously needed, necessary. But so he, from that initial move, which suggests sort of a strong and a shaming disapproval in response to their rebelliousness, he also he speaks in strong terms about sadness and grief. So he's one of the other reasons he gives for not coming to meet with them in person is to spare himself the sadness of doing so. And rather than show his face to them, he will pour out his heart and his tears to God on their behalf, and also send them this letter. And he employs quite a lot of language about mourning and grief in these opening paragraphs, sort of calling them to mourn their internal division, and also letting them know that what they ought to be feeling for they ought to be feeling grief at the prospect of their superior being replaced, rather than clamoring for her to be replaced. What they ought to be feeling is grief that she could be taken from them. So there is, I mean, there's a very explicit move on his part to sort of to suggest that the emotional path that they should be taking is from one of division and conflict to grief and sadness, in which he sort of is already instigates by being the one who is himself sad and crying tears over their state. And then there are a number of other ways in which this plays a role in the letter. So, I mean, there's horror, there's shame, there's a call to, he'll talk later about anger again. But I mean, part of what I think is what all of this attention to the emotional registers to which he's calling them, and the ways in which he's sort of calling them into a change of heart, not just in their attitudes, but in their emotional lives, is that he's deeply worried about the state of the of the relationships in this community. And I think that this is I mean, we see an expression of concern that comes out of that reflects also a desire for a harmony and an accord, and an intimacy that he expresses quite clearly in the letter, and to which he calls them. So on the one hand, there's the disapproval and the grief and mourning that they should feel, the shame that they should feel, and the horror at their rebelliousness. But also at the same time, this sense of the kind of oneness of heart and the harmony of restored relationship that he puts forward as a kind of communal ideal. He's also deeply worried about pride. So, and here we do have a sort of a very typical Augustinian concern with haughtiness and disdain. And it's particularly striking in the monastic context, where, as we see from the rules that he lays out, the norms for the life that they are to lead are very austere. It involves the renunciation of all private property. And this in particular is actually a worry that he has about the kinds of distortions in communal relationships between the nuns that might obtain. And so he's worried that the ones who came from wealthy backgrounds will sort of look down on the ones who came from poor backgrounds, and so in a way there's an interesting allusion there, I think, to the ways in which pride can be tied, can sort of endure in this context in which all have been in theory rendered equal in their status and possessions, and yet the attachment to past identities and past lives, past selves, may endure in this new form of life into which they're meant to be moving. But at the same time, some of the rules that are meant to sort of be responsive to the particular needs of nuns in different, who may have different health statuses and so on, is another way in which this distribution of these common resources is not actually, is not sort of strictly egalitarian. It does respond to the particularity of each person and their situation. And that too, we might imagine, could be a source of strife. Now, I'll just briefly, one of the most striking parts of the rule is the attention that he gives to, or the exhortations that he gives to the nuns about attending to their physical appearance and to the ways in which they might interact with men on their, when they are out and about in public. And this is something that has been discussed in some of the literature. And I think that this is actually one of the points on which some of the most sort of the strongest critiques are really right on. And so one of the things that he tells the nuns to do is you have to make sure that you cover your hair and make sure that they're not so thin as to see the hairnet underneath, and make sure that you're neither too careless nor too meticulous in how you arrange your hair, because and then there is this long paragraph, really in the context of what is not a super long rule, about how to attend to your posture, your habit, all of your movements, so that there might be nothing to arouse the desire of anyone. And if your eyes fall on someone, make sure that you don't look too long, because the looks are so powerful, and you don't want to either attract attention or convey attention. And so he talks about the importance of modest eyes. But then much of the rest of the rule, I mean, the other thing that he says here is that the sisters should police each other's gazes, and they should be, and their observance of all of these rules of sort of dress and conduct, and it's quite, if part of the object, you might think, of this sort of community set apart would be to liberate oneself, or to find a kind of emancipation from precisely these kinds of self-scrutinizing cares and concerns about one's appearance and one's conduct and the ways one's interacting with people to whom one might be attracted, or who might be attracted to oneself. Augustine says, no, you will have to be concerned. This is part of your vocation, is to attend really quite minutely to these aspects of your dress and conduct. And William Connolly, who I find in other aspects of his treatment of Augustine, both very interesting, but who often, I think, attributes to Augustine really sinister motives on some of these things, I think is quite right in his critique of Augustine on this particular letter and the rule, when he says that the practices that he enjoins them would appear to manufacture or produce the very things that he's telling them not to engage in. And so the sort of the discipline of vanity, the discipline of desire, is in fact focused on this intense self-scrutiny on how might one be appearing, or how might one's gaze sort of elicit these kinds of responses. I mean, it's actually, I think, in some ways, his description reveals his own sensitivity to sensuality, and to the power of gaze in romantic and erotic interactions. and yet his own conflictedness with those aspects seems very much on display here, and projected into this community where the sisters are called to both scrutinize themselves in precisely these ways that draw attention to that sensuality, but police themselves and others. And he goes into this whole detailed thing about how the order in which they should call each other to account, and then report each other to each other, and then to the superior, and so on. And there's a kind of irony in that William Connolly points out in sort of disciplining the forward eye by turning all of the forward eyes of the nuns onto each other. And yet, for all of that, there is a kind of recognition of the ways in which we can deceive ourselves about what we're doing, and about our forms of attention. And this, I think, is really, he ends the letter with a very interesting image where he sort of says, enjoins them to see yourselves in this book as a little mirror and have it read to them weekly, which is obviously intended as a kind of habituating practice, which I find a little disturbing given what I've just said about the mutual surveillance that I think is present in that aspect of the letter in particular, but which also is an interesting use of the image of the mirror, which in one of the, given that one of the other uses of it that I love, in fact, is of the image of God in the self as a kind of as a kind of mirror, but that must turn that should be turned to God in order to receive the image of God into oneself, not one that one has oneself. And so it's quite striking for him to use the image of the mirror, I find, in relation to his text, his rule for the nuns, in which he sort of calls them to see themselves. And the dynamics of authority that entails are both in relation to his text, which is a kind of presence of himself in this community. Although he's withheld his physical presence, he has sent them this text to have a really quite regular presence among them by being read weekly, and to describe it as a mirror in which to see themselves. So that is I think I've probably spoken as much or more than I should have. So maybe I'll end it there, and by just invoking both the great interest that Augustine's rhetorical and epistolary expressions evoke, and also some of their, I think, more complex and distressing features on this front.
Jamie, do you have some thoughts?
No, thanks, Sarah. I think it's such a brilliant portal to come into the letters is to look at this address to women, and yeah. I love your sense of that attention to the emotional register. That's something I hadn't really sort of registered in reading that. I have to say, I have just two thoughts, and I'll pass it back to Jim. But I also find it just fascinating in that letter to the nuns that here's Augustine, the great bishop and theologian, who actually has recommendations about laundry, about how to keep moths out of your clothes. Right. And there's important. And I don't know if it's just like micromanaging by the bishop, or if it's more like somebody who is so attuned to the textured realities of spiritual community and embodied life and things like that. So I find that interesting. The other thing, I'll just say one more thing, is I love your point about, we have too much of Augustine's account of women, which I think are deeply problematic. And here we get some addresses to women. One of the things that strikes me in the first letter that you highlighted, letter 188 to Juliana, is, for example, I'm thinking now as a philosopher and now thinking back to somebody in the ancient world, it's very, very hard to imagine an Aristotle ever devoting any kind of energy or time to making an argument to a woman as an interlocutor, because someone like Aristotle just never imagines she has any rational capacity by which. And so there is something about, I don't think it undoes everything else in Augustine's corpus, but I think there is a sort of performative affirmation of the democratization of illumination that Augustine is saying, no, Juliana, I need to convince you of this. There's an argument to be made here. There's an epistemic respect, if you will, in that I think you've highlighted really, really well. Thank you.
So I have a question for Sarah, and then a comment. And I may be reading the Juliana letter a bit differently than you are, Jamie, on this. The question really is, when you went through basically the rules for a women's monastery, and I too was struck by the concern with policing sexuality, but my sense is it's all male sexuality that he's concerned with. There's not the assumption that the women themselves might have an independent sexuality.
Yeah, so I mean, that's actually something I was interested. Anyway, I noted this and I didn't get to it, but it's all male sexuality, and the ways in which women, though, participate in eliciting it, the pleasure that they might take in being desired. But also, I mean, so he makes this interesting comment towards the end, and this is in a different context, where he talks about the modesty So it's on page 500, and he says, the love between you ought to be spiritual, however, not carnal. For the actions of persons not mindful of modesty, even of women with one another, in shameful jokes and games, ought to be avoided. And I wonder what he's referring to there. I mean, is he talking about a kind of complicity, a joking about? I mean, I wonder to what extent he is referring to, if not, relationships, whether love relationships of a romantic nature or sexual ones. Is the shameful jokes and games a kind of reference to sexual joking around, a kind of complicity that women might have with each other, that he's sort of trying to ward off? I mean, I wonder what that, and what is the nature of the spiritual but not carnal love that is not supposed to be enacted in shameful jokes and games. So I wondered if there was some kind of allusion to female sexuality in there, but it's obviously not, it's not clear to me, at least. But no, otherwise, the concern about the gaze is about male gazes, but women's intercepting of them.
But I guess in terms of the carnality that you just read, I wonder to what degree is he aware of close female friendships? And because right. And
I mean, because it seems to me that there, perhaps he's cutting out a really significant form of delight and pleasure in close, intimate friendships that you would have. I mean, all of that you would hope would be one of the rewards of living in that kind of community.
Yeah. And so the comment I had was largely on just a sense of just that letter of Juliana, at least the way it read to me. And although you didn't have a chance to talk about it, you did allude to it. The contrast to letter 20 star, one of the Divyak letters, to Fabiola, how do we say this?
Is it Fabiola?
We're going to go with Fabiola. That's close. But it really struck me, and Jamie, you might have a different sense of this, that the letter to Juliana, and I think the context is important to understand that this is post 410. You have Roman aristocrats fleeing to Africa, including Pelagius. And Augustine having a sense of his territory being invaded, or the borders are now coming to Africa in the way that the flow of traffic is coming to Africa in the way that it wasn't before. That letter really read to me almost as 100% about his anxiety about what kind of influence is Pelagius garnering, especially among aristocratic Roman women. I mean, the letter,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's this sort of hand waving. Of course, virginity is a high state, but then there's this almost harangue about the dangers of glorying in something that's going to cause, pride, but I think even more concretely, social disruption. And he really seems to want to know what kind of literature or contact has the family had with Pelagius, and he's particularly concerned that Pelagius is hiding his real intentions and at least just mouthing true beliefs about grace that he doesn't actually believe. But I think what set him off was just the realization that Juliana had asked Pelagius
to totally
on behalf of her, on behalf of her daughter, for her daughters, and so that struck me as really kind of women are just basically in this context part of a larger political contest he's having with Pelagius and Pelagians. Fabiola, you didn't talk much about it, but most of it's a very complicated letter about the priest, a bishop named Antoninus, who was from a poor family in the area and was basically raised in the monastery at Hippo. And Augustine puts him in a position of authority that Augustine himself makes clear Antoninus wasn't ready for. And Antoninus early figures that he's not good at being loved, so he'll work on being feared, and he's a complete exploiter. And Fabiola takes him in. And in this letter, you get a sense, whereas in the Juliana letter, you get a sense of Augustine's not giving her a great deal of authority for her own views. She's just basically reading her the riot act and making sure that she doesn't fall for Pelagius. Fabiola really is a source of spirit. Augustine's admitting that he screwed up, this man has become a horror show in a lot of ways, and is causing a lot of pain among the more impoverished parts of Fusala and the surrounding diocese.
And that he can't do much about it because they don't trust him anymore.
And he has this line to her towards the end. He says, I wanted you to be informed, like all this political stuff seemed endless. And he says, not that you might hate him, but so you might look after him in a true and spiritual fashion. So this is one of the cases where actually the woman he's addressing, I think he feels has more spiritual authority than he does, given the situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, it is striking how he says, this is my mistake. Can you help me fix it? Yeah, can you do what I can't do because I no longer have the trust of this community? Because of my mistake. But yeah, I mean, I think that the contest obviously is between Augustine and Pelagius in the first one. But he is concerned about who's sort of getting where people's loyalties are, and this is clearly there's clearly something important there for him. But there's a kind of pettiness in him being like, "Did you really write to him?"
No, that really came through. How
guy.
Could you? Yeah,
which I think is sort of funny.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you, Sarah. And that's a great selection of letters. Jamie, you want to say something about the ones you picked out?
So I have to just start by saying I'm a sucker for correspondence. I just absolutely love reading letters. I'm reading the letters of Iris Murdoch right now, which are very juicy and wonderful. And probably one of my favorite books of all time are the letters of Shelby Foote and Walker Percy, which is just a remark. Of course, there's something about correspondence that I don't know if it's slightly voyeuristic, but there's also, I think, a humanity that comes through in correspondence, so that you meet characters afresh and askance and aslant, and that's always how I experienced Augustine's letters. One of the great gifts of my doctoral studies at Villanova was all of the Augustinians and patristic scholars there, who I would say introduced me to the whole Augustine, not just the anthologized Augustine of the philosophers, and not just the Augustine of the polished treatises, but this Augustine who preached sermons and wrote letters. And it's still disappointing to me how many both undergrads and then also seminarians, div school students who sadly, I think, don't often encounter the sermons or letters of Augustine. And to me, that means you're kind of missing half of his soul and half of his humanity. And so I'm really grateful for the essential letters. This is something that I regularly recommend, along with the essential sermons, just as really great gateways for people to encounter a side of Augustine that they haven't seen before. And you see there's a kind of intimacy in here. There's so many aspects of Augustine that I think are great. I thought I would highlight just a couple of themes from some letters that are in the anti-Pelagian controversy, which might not sound like a sexy, fun way to meet Augustine, except that well, there's a couple things I would note. You see that for Augustine, the anti-Pelagian controversy about freedom and grace is really primarily a pastoral concern, or it is largely a pastoral concern for him. And I think you can see, so I'm talking about letters 214 and 215, which are highlighted, and I want to give Augustine a little bit of voice here. He ends letter 214 in section 7. He's just cited from 2 Peter, and he ends this way. He says, "Be attentive then to the frightening words of such a great apostle, and where you think that you do not understand, believe for the time being the words of God, that there exists both the free choice of a human being and the grace of God, without the help of which free choice can neither turn back to God nor make progress toward God." And I guess I should probably also just admit that when I'm reading Augustine's letters and sermons, I'm interested in it not just as a scholar, but also because I'm a co-pilgrim. Do you know what I mean? There's a sort of fusion of horizons here, and so I'm also, I'm listening to somebody who's trying to give me insight into the complexity and difficulty of the spiritual life, and when you see that Augustine is, what he's worried about is if people misunderstand this mystery of grace and freedom, it derails their spiritual progress, right? This ability to turn towards God and to make their way towards God and to be caught up in God's life. And I think it reframes. Sometimes philosophers have a tendency to come to the Pelagian controversy, and we just treat it as if we're like 20th century analytic people debating about free will. Whereas for Augustine, there's an added layer of burden about that. So what's interesting is, these are letters 214 and 215. The context for them is actually 194, which is also included in the volume and is a long substantive letter. The dynamic that happens here is this. Augustine writes this 194. I'm trying to remember who 194 is addressed to. To Sixtus, who becomes a future pope.
Right.
And it's kind of standard anti-Pelagian articulation of what Pelagius is getting wrong. By the time we get to letter 214, this is where I'm imagining the screenplay in my head, right? And so what's interesting is letter 214 and 215 are written because of a kind of purloined letter. In other words, some characters find what we have as letter 194, take it back to their monastery, read it in a different context, and come to the conclusion that their abbot should really stop disciplining them, and that they really, they should just kind of let go and let God. Why are you being so hard on us with discipline? So I'm partly fascinated by this sort of purloined letter dynamic, where Augustine is also realizing, what Jacques Derrida and others, Roland Barthes would call the death of the author, because when his letters end up in other places where he hadn't intended them to land, they are read very, very differently. So 2:14 and 2:15 are like, no, in a different context. You're completely misunderstanding the concern, right? You heard me say effort, works, discipline is not important at all. It's like, no. We're trying to get this mystery of holding together, that everything is possible by means only of God's grace. But what is possible by God's grace is a free will that is renewed in order to act and have agency. So it's kind of, I picture this Cresconius and Felix, these guys who like got this letter and they take it back to their monastery, and they're like, dude, Augustine says, actually, it doesn't matter. You could do kind of, it's not, we don't have to work at this too hard. And Augustine says, no. There's concerns here. I also just have to highlight, so in letter 2:15, I'm not doing justice to this, but there's so much more that could be said. But to get, again, sort of the feel of the humanity of what you get in the letters, I love it then. So letter 2:15 is addressed to the abbot of this monastery, Valentine. And one of the other things that you see going on here, I think this is kind of laughable. I don't think Augustine meant it to be funny, but get this. So Augustine is trying to address this monastic community, and he's like, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that you don't have to do anything. And he writes this correction, but then this is the ancient version of TLDR, too long, didn't read, because this is Augustine, the second paragraph of his letter to the abbot. I had no need to discuss at greater length in this letter as well his most difficult question, namely concerning the will and grace. I didn't have to talk about that in that other letter, because I'd already given the monks another letter on the supposition that they were going to return earlier. Oh, and I also wrote a book for you. Classic Augustine. It's like, oh yeah, I've got an afternoon, I'm going to write a book. I also wrote a book for you. And if you read it carefully, with the help of the Lord, and understand it with a lively mind, I think that there will no longer be any disputes among you on this topic. In other words, basically, I wrote the book that settles the question. If you would just read it, we would not have any more problems. I kind of love this sort of, maybe I'm too friendly to Augustine, but there's a sort of enchanting hubris in that. And then he says, the monks, however, also carry with them other writings that we believed ought to send to you, by which you may know how, by the mercy of God, the Catholic Church repelled the venom of the Pelagian heresy. He says there are letters to Pope Innocent, the Bishop of the city of Rome, one from the Council of the province of Carthage, another from the Council of Numidia. There's a more detailed letter sent to him by 5 bishops and its responses to these 3 letters. There's a letter to Pope Zosimus, an African council. He just goes on and on, and basically saying, I'm sending you, here's the library that I'm sending back to you to solve this question. If you guys would just read it, I think we would have everything solved. Probably a little bit of overconfidence in what text can perform here, but I kind of love Augustine's energy as a teacher here. It's like, right, one of your students emails you and asks, I've been thinking a little bit about this, and then you write back and here's a bibliography of 18,000 books that you should read. The last thing I'll highlight, just because I don't want to steal too much of our time, is the letters help me to appreciate that for Augustine, this controversy, which is so easily abstracted, and by the way, does not always bring out the best of Augustine. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not my favorite side of Augustine, even though I deeply identify with his struggle to honor the dynamics of our crooked hearts and our incapacities of the will, and the gratuitousness of God's grace, and yet the renewal of human will and spiritual endeavor. I'm with him in all of that. One of the things I love in these letters is how often prayer keeps coming up. In other words, one of the ways he's thinking through this is, how could we possibly pray if it weren't the case that there is this mystery of the will that is renewed by the grace of God? And so that's really highlighted in 194 at several places. I don't know if I might find, if I can give you one place where he says this, 194 section 10, if I can find that quickly. You can see him, he says, hence, in order that a man at prayer might not extol himself or the merit of his prayer, even if help is given to him as he prays, in order to conquer the desires for temporal goods, and in order to love eternal goods and God's, the source of all good things, the faith that prays was given to him when he did not pray. And unless it had been given, he could not pray. And again, I think that's actually, there's this tension and paradox and mystery that you just see then carried out throughout our kind of mystical traditions, our contemplative traditions. I think you find this in Merton. I think you find it in Hildegard. I think you find it in Brother Lawrence. This sort of mystery of like wanting to pray is itself already a sign that I've been given the grace to pray. And so he ends, I can finish with this, in letter 215, the very end of it, this is quite a lovely sort of coda, if you will, to this theme, that really the reason why you want to understand how grace and free will are interacting is in order that you can grow in God. And so he says, this is again addressed to the monastery, pray for this grace for yourselves, pray for it for us, pray for it for all those who love you and for those who hate you. Pray for it persistently and vigilantly in brotherly peace. May you live for God. If I have merited anything for you, such a lovely little rhetorical spin there. If I have merited anything from you, let Brother Florus come to me. That sense of a giftedness at the root of everything, a giftedness at our very spiritual capacity. That's what I think comes out in some of these letters. And I appreciate sort of the peek behind the curtain and to see Augustine the pastor and Augustine the bishop in trying to help people understand this, maybe sometimes so that he wins the argument. But I think genuinely also so that he can see growth in these communities. And so I find that instructive in that regard. I'll leave it at that if there's, yeah.
Thanks, Jamie.
Is that okay, Jim? Is that helpful?
That's
Great.
perfect. Perfect. Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for that.
About this.
Well, this is just sort of one of the things that I really like in these letters, and especially at the end of 214, and this is sort of your mention of the interplay with free choice reminded me of this. I really like this last paragraph of that letter, but particularly the way that he's just weaving scriptural references throughout, and you see this in so many of the letters, but they're especially they jumped out at me, especially in these letters, in this paragraph in particular, because of the way that he's sort of tying free will to understanding and the importance of its working in those ways. And he cites the Psalms, and he cites Luke, and he cites James, and it's just a really lovely conclusion to that letter. And I particularly, in a way, this is one of the things about the categories. You can see Augustine the exegete here too so clearly, but it's not sort of restrained only to any one set of letters. It's sort of throughout you see his constant interweaving of scriptural references. But I like this one, example of that in particular.
I think it's a great one to highlight, and it's a great theme to highlight. You're right that there's a sense in the letters you see the extent to which Augustine's imagination is just infused and suffused by scripture, right? Like it's so his given lexicon, and to see a mind working in a storied way in that sense. Yeah, I think it's a great evidence of that.
So Jamie, I have a question for you who are not, you're a professor of philosophy, but you're also a holder of a chair of applied reformed theology.
Right, yeah.
So this is in some ways, this should really be your territory. So I'm going to allude to letter 215a, which is really short. And basically it's Augustine is thanking Valentine for having sent Brother Florus over to Hippo to get some instruction in the workings of grace. And poor Brother Florus had been the monk who had ventured this, interpretation of Augustine's doctrine of grace, basically to get out of being rebuked by his abbot. And so he basically gets sent to the big principal, in Hippo. And I'll just read the last line, then I'll ask you my question of this little letter. It says, like, I thank you again. This is to Valentine, the abbot at Hadrumetum. I ask you again that you be so good as to fill not merely my desire, but that of both of us, and that you send him, Brother Florus, again, that he may be with us for some time. For I think that this will be beneficial for him and for us, and that his fuller instruction, which we'll be able to obtain through us with the help of the Lord, will be profitable for the brothers themselves. May you always be pleasing to God. So I have a little bit of sympathy for Brother Florus. I mean, at one level,
can you imagine the fire hose that he's
at one level, I'm thinking like they got along. They had a good meeting, but Augustine, on the first one, Augustine was sick, so he didn't get enough of time with Brother Florus. And now the request is bring him back, but let him have an extended stay so he can have fuller instruction. Now, I guess my question to you is, and this is related to your sense of grace as a pastoral doctrine, not one of speculative theology. Is the doctrine just simply too hard as to grasp as a theoretical doctrine that poor Brother Florus needs to basically have, at least a semester of study with the promulgator himself of the doctrine to know what's going on?
Yeah. I think that's a fair concern. On the other hand, I think the phenomenon of living into the reality is also just inherently difficult. So you could say, I need Florus here so that he can pass the examination and say back to me what I need to hear. On the other hand, I guess I do think that this is like one of the, this is the fear and trembling, right? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And I think everybody is spending a lifetime trying to just figure out what that is. So I'm sympathetic that this is probably a school you never graduate from. Though I also sympathize with poor Florus, getting the one-on-one tutorial when it's got to be a bit of a harangue, I'm sure, at times.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to try to be brief, so we have some time for a question and answers session for everyone. I'm just going to, the letters I want to say a few words about are to they are Augustine to Novatus. Novatus is someone that Augustine met when he was a student and then a teacher of rhetoric at Carthage. And Demetrius comes from a wealthy Carthaginian family. And they became very close. These are two men who clearly loved one another, and it came out in the correspondence. Professor Naring puts the letters I'm going to talk about, 3 and 7, under Augustine the philosopher as the category. And these letters are contexts in which Augustine is dealing with themes in Platonic philosophy, particularly the distinction between an intelligible reality that's not bodily and a sensible reality that is bodily, though therefore subject to division, change, and corruption. And I think that's right as a placement, but I think what's really striking is how profoundly the friendship between Novatus and Augustine is affecting Augustine's exploration of Platonism at this time in his life. The Novatus correspondence, that is the letters back and forth between these two men, we have 12 letters, 3 to 14 in the normal numbering. The ones that are in the Essential Augustine, as I said, are 3 and 7. In terms of the time period of these letters, well, they begin while Augustine is still in Italy, where he was in Rome, and then Milan, and then a brief retreat at a place called Cassiciacum, which was a country estate owned by a wealthy friend of his, Verecundus. And then he goes back to Ostia and Rome for a time, and eventually he goes back to Africa. And the Novatus dies in 391, which is a couple of years after his return to Tagaste. Novatus went back to Carthage before Augustine had left for Africa in order to take care of a sick mother. I did want to mention that this time period in Augustine's life, between 386, 387, and around 491, is the time of his conversion to the form of Christianity he was most attracted to practicing. It's also a time where he is undergoing profound griefs. His mother dies in Ostia, and then when he's back in Tagas, within about a year, 2 years, his son Adeodatus dies, and Novatus, who is his best friend, also dies. And I really get the sense in reading the letters to Novatus that he has a profound appreciation and apprehension about mortality in the way that he's thinking about his life as a historical human being and how to relate that life to broader realities that don't necessarily die in the way that the human body seems obviously to do so. So in letter 3, which is dated to early 387, Augustine is at the Cassiciacum retreat with his mother, his brother, and some of his close friends. And Verecundus is there, although Verecundus, who is basically financing the retreat, will also be one of the people who dies in this period. He's not as close to Augustine as Novatus, but he is a friend. And Augustine is writing from Cassiciacum to Novatus, who's returned to Carthage. And it starts off with Augustine, I said before that the address is really what makes, of course, a piece of writing a letter. These two men consider themselves intensely close to one another. So Augustine basically skips the address and just plunges right into whatever he wants to say. And Augustine says, like, you almost convinced me, not of course that I am happy, but that's a lot of the sage alone, but I am at least like something happy. So Augustine is appealing to something that in a previous letter, and Novatus had done the provocative thing of saying that Augustine is beatus, which is getting translated as happy. But beatus for Augustine and Novatus means, if it's happy is the right translation, it's a very specific kind of happiness. It's really a condition of perfection, where you have access to the good and you have been right about the good, and you're able to enjoy it in the right ways, both for you and for those around you. But there's also a component that relates to security and living the good life. And this is equally important to Augustine. So when he says that being happy, being a beatus, is restricted to the sage, he means there are very few individuals who have ever had both a perfect enjoyment of the good and a perfect security in that enjoyment of the good. So he's playing around. He says, like, he can't imagine why Nebridius would even think of him as somebody who resembles a beatus, someone who is perfect. And he comes to the conclusion that, well, Nebridius just writes what he thought would be most pleasing to me. And this sets the stage for the kind of correspondence they have. These men just delight in provoking one another to write to one another. And at some level, they can be doing some heavy reflection, but another level, they're just enjoying one another's company through these letters. And Augustine does in letter 3 go into a very complicated, I can't figure out, meditation on the difference between an intelligible number and a sensible number. Sensible numbers don't admit of increase, but they can be decreased to the point of nothingness. Intelligible numbers maintain what they are throughout increases and decreases. If that makes any sense to you, very good. I think roughly it's this. If I think of a sensible number as when I'm using something material to define a number. So this is 1 pen. This defines 1. I can't increase it because the pen's the pen. It would have to take something outside of it. But I can chop it up into bits until it's firmly nothing. And that's what, if it's functioning as a sensible number, then it really refers to bodies, things that can corrupt and go to nothing. Whereas the intelligible number, which is the more obscure part, it's not quite clear what that is, except it is something that doesn't really, in its interaction with other intelligible realities, it doesn't really change its essential form. The number 1 doesn't change because my pen breaks and becomes 2 pieces. It remains the number that it is. Augustine says about this reasoning, he writes, "There's surely something hidden here, but now I must go to sleep." So it's clear there's a kind of openness to intellectual play that's important here. And then he recounts what he calls his cherished little argument, where he talks about the human being as both body and soul. And the soul is the eternal part of us, and the body is the temporal part of us. And of course, they have something to do with one another as far as Augustine is concerned. But at this stage of his life, he's really trying to focus in on what is eternal. And I suspect it really has much to do with him wanting the love that he has for someone like Nebridius never to perish. But if that love depends upon the bodily deportment of a life, it seems like it's a love that is destined to disappear ultimately. Towards the end of letter 3, Augustine wonders out loud whether or not his love for Nebridius isn't really the love for a good of fortune. If it's a good of fortune, then it was a set of circumstances that Augustine couldn't predict or control that led him into Nebridius's presence, and it'll be a set of circumstances and forces beyond his control that will remove Nebridius from his presence. He's remarkably chill, actually, about that possibility, and he concludes the letter with a rather erudite joke. He writes, "Well, while the wise who alone are beati, happy, perfect, wanted goods of fortune to be neither feared nor coveted, because if you fear or covet them, you put your well-being out of your own control. You worry, dear Nebridius, about what conjugation cupio, the Latin word that means to covet, belongs, and to whether to be desired, the passive infinitive, should be cupi or cupiri." Now, for the longest time, I could not understand why this letter would finish with grammatical confusion between 2 men who are highly trained in rhetoric and not knowing that the verb cupio is actually the third conjugation, not the fourth conjugation of the verb, is completely implausible. Actually, my good friend, who's a brilliant reader of Augustine, Catherine Cunningham, who is a classicist at Bryn Mawr and writes really important things on Augustine and other kinds of things, just pointed out to me, is like, they're not serious. Augustine's not serious. It's a joke. And the last line of it is, I can't say, he says, I can't say how great a pleasure it is to read your letter. So you have grammatical speculation, you have philosophical speculation, but it's really framed by a personal love that allows space for even talking about things that they already know a lot about and don't have a lot of, questions about. But it creates a space for free play of the mind, which is something actually I think as the letters advance down the years, Augustine allows himself less and less. So let me just say just a word or two about book 7. I mean, not book 7, letter 7, which is also Augustine to Novatus. In a previous letter, which isn't in the essential letters, Novatus advances. Novatus loves to get Augustine to speculate about philosophical matters. Novatus comes up with two theories about the imagination. One is that although not everything imagined is remembered, memory is impossible apart from an image. Like if we didn't have an imagination, we wouldn't have the capacity to remember. So that's thesis 1. Thesis 2 is imagination can generate images of sensible things that are not actually in play any longer. So Demetrius's mother dies a little before a little after he returns to Carthage. She's no longer there as a sensible being in order to be recalled, but Demetrius still has an imagination for her. So that way of thinking about imagination it relies on a sensible foundation, and then it can editorialize. It can either simply recollect what the sense image was originally, or it can pick another sense imagery. Demetrius suggests a more radical possibility that the imagination actually can generate its own images apart from sensation. And so it's much more distant from sensation than Augustine normally would allow. Augustine thinks that sense and imagination are closely tied. You can't really pull them apart. And really what the distance is that we have to pay attention to is between sensation and imagination kind of grouped as images, dealing with images and bodies and images, and the intellect really being free from that in some ways. He doesn't like either of Demetrius's theories, and I'm not going to bother to rehearse the reasons why. I'm just going to give you some sense of the use to which he wants to put the conclusion that sense and imagination are closely tied, and the intellect, which is very different from sensation, should be kept different. I'm going to quote just the very end of this letter. He writes to Demetrius, "Hence by our friendship and by our very fidelity to the divine law, I earnestly warn you, my very dear and most delightful friend, not to enter into friendship with these shadows of the lower world, and not to hesitate to break off that friendship you have begun. For in no way do we resist the senses of the body, which is for us a most sacred duty, if we show fondness for the blows and wounds that they inflict." So I think actually the fascination that Augustine has for intellect is it promises a form of being that when we attend to it is always present, and we have a sense that it is never absent. From the only absence that's involved with it is our own being diverted away to sensible things, which enter the soul as if it were wounding the soul, because sensibilia reminds us of our attachments to things that perish. And the hope, I think, with Novatus is to find something in the eternal realm that really corresponds to the love that the two men share. This is what he's after. So the last thing I want to say about this actually is not actually in the letters, but I think the exchange between Novatus and Augustine in letter 7 shows Augustine's going to have a very different way of understanding the challenges of love in a world where people are lost. This is actually from the Confessions, and it's his description in book 9 of the death of Novatus. And I'm just going to read the last part of it. Augustine has already said that, you know, he mentions that Novatus had converted when he got back to Carthage. He converts his old household. He lived a decent and a pure and a virtuous life, and now he lives in Abraham's bosom. That quote from Luke that Augustine cites in that context. Then Augustine writes, "Whatever that may be, whatever the gospel word bosom may mean, there my Novatus is living, to me a friend most tenderly loved, to you, Lord, a freed man adopted as to your son. Yes, there he lives on. Where else could such a soul be at home? He is alive in that place about which he used to ask me so many questions, ignorant and paltry fellow that I am. No longer does he bend his ear to my mouth, rather does he lay the mouth of his spirit to your fountain and avidly slake his thirst as he drinks your wisdom to the uttermost of his capacity, a happiness without end." And now the kicker, this is an amazing line. "Yet I cannot believe that he is so inebriated as to forget me, since you, Lord, from whom he drinks, are mindful of us." Completely different way of understanding what it would mean to be remembered to those that we love and how we might be remembered by them in another life. And I think the letters to Novatus, which is the period of Augustine's Platonism, though again, I think is a bit misleading, are just a wonderful contrast to the Augustine of the Confessions, who thinks the best proof of the endurance of love is our capacity, our grace-given capacity to love in a realm of loss and change. Anyway, that's all. I'll stop there and see if either Sarah or Jamie have some comments.
I'm so glad you highlighted these letters, Jim. And by the way, that passage from the Confessions is one of my favorite selections. Just such an amazing. One of the reasons I love that you've highlighted these letters is when you were talking about that free play that we feel like going on in these letters. It seems to me these early letters are a glimpse, and maybe I'm ignorant about this, but it feels like it's in these letters that we get a glimpse of a correspondence where Augustine is not so constantly self-conscious that somebody else will be reading what he's writing. Do you know what I mean? By the time, I think by the time we get to the later letters, and lots of letters that Sarah and I were highlighting, just given his public role and public profile and his awareness of, it's like everybody's reading your tweets and he knows that. And so I think when he's writing the letters in that later stage, the whole world is always sitting on his shoulder. And so I think there's so much kind of self-policing that goes on. What I love in the beauty of these early letters is both the intellectual friendship that you can see playing out here, but I also think a certain lack of self-consciousness about it that gives him a freedom to sort of play, joke in ways that we kind of lose down the road, sadly. So I'm really glad that you highlighted those. Yeah,
thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, I really like the way intimacy. I mean, what part of what you make clear is that intimacy allows for play. And Augustine often, he's often, that's not a side you find it. You do find Augustine's playfulness, even in the treatises. But it's not necessarily the first thing that readers of Augustine think of, and not necessarily the first thing that you think of on friendship, particularly because some of his accounts of friendship, for example, in the Confessions, are so tortured.
Yeah.
So I like that he expresses all of this agonizing self-doubt about the delight and intimacy that he feels. And here you just have the playfulness that intimacy allows in that unselfconscious way that you were highlighting, Jamie. It made me think too that he does. It made me think of a letter, another letter that it comes later. It's a letter to Novatus, where he's denying Novatus's request for his friend to come to him, and which Augustine is denying. And he has this, and yet in denying him his request, he sort of goes on about how painful it is to be parted from your friends, and what deep longing he feels for his friends, and the longing that he feels for, eternity in which we will dwell and part no more. And I think it seems like he does come to, instead of sort of thinking about that interplay between the present and the eternity as this agonizing thing that he's not getting right somehow, he seems to find a place for his longing in a way, in that tension. Anyway, that's another lovely letter on friendship, and I think that's why I asked you thing to highlight.
When he was talking about the community of women, I kind of wonder, is his imaginary allow him to realize that the women that are in this community, may have an Novatus Augustine kind of playfulness. But I think, Jamie, getting back to what you were saying before, my sense of really the heaviness of some of his writing thereafter is his experience of communities is often threatened. These are communities that are threatened by social dissension. I think, honestly, he's less obsessed about sexuality in a lot of the letters than he is about the disruptions within that sort of certain kinds of presumptions of worth and value due to communities. Like he's extremely, the more I think he becomes, an active priest and then a bishop. I mean, the whole thing with Antoninus, it's a comedy tragedy. It's just keeping these communities together in such a way that there's a possibility of any kind of harmony. Like the human inclination to assume a hierarchy and then try to live it out in arbitrary ways, he's very well aware of. That may be the answer to this doctrine of grace. Is like grace basically says, look, you get to be fully developed as an individual human being, but it doesn't make you better than anybody else. Anyway, so Ian, if you're there, I'm going to let you just say a couple of words about the Augustine blog, and then we're going to take a few questions, and then we're going to probably have to say goodbye at that point. Ian Claussen is one of the associate directors at the Augustinian Institute, and he is also the editor of Augustinian Studies, which is really like the main journal in Augustine scholarship. And we love him very much, and he's going to say just a word or two about the Augustine blog.
Love you too, Jim. Thanks, that was wonderful to listen to. And it's wonderful to see all the names on the right-hand column here, many of which I know, many from working with the Augustinian Studies Journal. As you know, a journal is a selective venue for scholars to publish their work. It takes a long time to put things together. Some things don't make it that probably should, and some things make it, and don't get the kind of readership that they deserve. So it's very exciting that on behalf of the Augustinian Institute and in conjunction with New City Press, I get to announce the unveiling of what we're currently calling and will call the Augustine blog, with the subtitle Theology for Transitional Times. And I like how Jim puts it in his description of this blog, that the aim here is really part of what the Augustinian Institute is all about, and NCP for that matter, which is to let Augustine out of the house, so to speak, and introduce him to a world struggling for insight to that most burdened and yet indispensable of notions, the spiritual life. And so this is kind of a coming soon announcement. In a couple of weeks, we're confident that we can unveil this blog to the wider world of interested Augustine readers, Augustine scholars, anyone who might just want to peek in. We was said a bit earlier, actually at the beginning, Jim said we're not quite the culture of letters that maybe we once were. We're going to test whether we are still a culture of blogging. I think blogging has sort of made a comeback in various guises. But blogging is a way to peek into other people's thoughts on Augustine that sort of published, sort of the more formal manner isn't as satisfying. But it also avoids the trap of sort of trying to read into thinkers' thoughts based on 140, whatever the Twitter limit is, like 280 text characters. We all like to be a little bit voyeuristic, Jamie, I think, in our sort of find out what other people think. The blog is going to be a place where people can reflect on Augustine in a less formal way, maybe, and also to make announcements about upcoming exciting ventures like this one, new books coming out, new conferences, gatherings, literature reviews. There will also be, I'm sure, plenty of Augustine snippets that we'll be posting from the translated portions of the New City Press, and announcements, of course, related to New City Press will also be there. I just want to say, though, as one of the, myself and Paul Camacho, who's the associate director of the Institute, we'll be looking forward to just pulling as many people as we can who are interested in both contributing to this, but also just reading it and keeping tabs and giving us insight and ideas for how we can continue to build this community and encourage one another as we explore Augustine and learn from Augustine, and even, dare I say, challenge Augustine in certain ways. And so, yeah, that's all I want to say. Hopefully the Aug blog, as it is affectionately known, will be coming soon and will be sent out, I'm sure, via email and other social media devices. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ian, very much. So we do have a couple of questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, and we should probably stick to short answers because I want to give Greg a chance to come in at the end for New City Press. So the first one from Samantha, and I'm going to answer this really quickly. She says, hello, I'm hoping one of the panelists would be able to point me to a scholarly source on the materiality of the letters and Augustine's works in general, meeting and recording, transmission, etc. I am now an archivist, but with an older PhD on Augustine. When I worked on the latter, it never occurred to me to delve deeply into materiality. I don't know the answer directly to that. Because Sarah's a theologian, and Jamie and I are philosophy. But I will find out for you, Samantha. So I know people who will know people. So contact me at some point at james.wetzel@villanova.edu, and I will give you the answer to that. Josh Sachs asks, there seems to be an emphasis on negative emotions, anger, grief, shame, pride. Sorry, the thing just shifted here. Here you go, it's back. Do we see a balance to call to other positive emotions, peacemaking, comfort, contentment, humility, joy? How does this deepen our understanding of an Augustinian psychology of emotion? And I think, Josh, Sarah, this was to you, and it's responding to your sense of what's going on in the letters of direction to the nuns.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, so one of the things that to point to, I think, is that in Augustine's letter to Felicity, so the letter preceding the letter to the nuns, he says, we should never, of course, we don't love disagreements, but they arise from love, and they can also be a test of love. And I don't know if it's always true that disagreements arise from love, but certainly in intimate communities that do involve relationships of love, disagreements arise. And I think that's so I think that already does point to the sense in which it's oriented to love. Otherwise, in the letter to the nuns, he does refer to, for example, this oneness of heart, which I think is a positive, is a sort of positive affective state that he's hoping for them. But it is there's not as much call to positive emotions in that letter as you do find elsewhere, though. So, I mean, in other letters, but also in some of his in his sermons, you really do have these lovely, rich, textured descriptions of positive emotions, and there is very much a balancing of sort of the hard and negative emotions with the as a kind of process that he hopes that he wants people to go through, which is to sort of by grappling or confronting the negative emotions, to move towards the positive ones. So even if it's not highly present in the letter to the nuns, you get hints of it, and then you get elaborations of those elsewhere.
Good. So this question is from Jonas Brandt. He writes, I'm curious if Augustine's official stances on theological doctrine are ever given more experimental treatments in the letters. Because of the informal nature of letter writing, does he find the space to play with the ambiguities of the weighty questions he is concerned with? Or alternatively, are the letters mere elaborations on answers he provides in his treatises? Any thoughts, team?
Yeah, I'm not, it's a little related a little bit to what we were discussing earlier, which is, and first of all, I'm not sure that any of the three of us would imagine that we can run through the Rolodex of all these letters in our heads. I'm trying to think of an instance where that happens. and as I said, I think once we're getting correspondence that is much more explicitly focused on theological questions and debates, I think we've already reached the point in Augustine's life where there's a kind of self-consciousness about the, if you will, the dissemination of letters beyond his control. And so I'm not sure that he would have, I just can't think of an instance. And I wonder if one of the reasons why we can't think of very obvious instances is because he's nervous about how those fall into places that people could then do things with. It's not unrelated to what I was talking about. You know, he basically has this long epistolary follow-up because a letter that he wrote for one context is purloined into another context, and then it means something entirely different. I think there's really interesting, it's funny, even it's only in our conversation today that I've become really intrigued by this dynamic of Augustine's inability to control how correspondence is received, and that might explain part of it.
Yeah, I think the answer is a qualified no. I mean, once so he's playing around with things in the letters to Novatus, but when he has a more secure Christology, which he could, and he's concerned, like what is the Orthodox version? I mean, it takes some time for things to travel in various parts of the world. So, but when he thinks that he's arrived at an official expression, of the Catholic faith, he is going to not veer from that. He may play with different interpretive possibilities within the doctrinal contrast, but he's not going to experiment like, well, what if the incarnation weren't true? How does this work? But within certain kinds of limits, he does play with things because he thinks that the truths of the faith leave a lot of room for interpretation. But he's really, I think, invested in making sure that the interpretation doesn't damage the church cohesion. So I think conservativeness. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to say that I think that that's right. But what you do get in the letters are sort of riffs and also you get elaborations that are responding to very concrete sort of problems, dilemmas, or scenarios that I think do give that I think really do add to the sort of more doctrinal treatise-oriented ways in which he's dealing with those questions. In the letters, you get him responding and not just expounding. And I think that does give a sort of additional color and texture.
Yeah.
Even if it's maybe not experimental, but it is concrete and riffing in a kind of way that is, it's not just sort of repeating sort of what he's already said.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's what makes the letter so fascinating. So I'm gonna, I apologize to those out there whose question won't get answered, but we are creatures of time and there's some limitation. I will end with one question that kind of ties it into the contemporary context. This is from Johnson Shigiri. It says, well, he notes, what runs through the letters seems to be a mood characterized by pastoral care, more specifically characterized by authority, certainty, and personal fondness. Could this mood be expected to be stable across timelines, or do the moods change to what we now have in sending our content in emails and PDFs characterized by politeness, less assertiveness, and almost suggesting you're right in your way and I'm right in my ways? Have we lost something sensible, or have we grown into something better than what Augustine and their friends had in their day? Wow. Well, that one's worth a lot of reflection. Any quick words about that, crew?
Well, it is, yeah, that's a pretty huge can of worms. I'll just say, I actually have always been struck by Augustine's own variable moods in correspondence. In other words, I mean, I think the context change a lot, and including in letters that aren't in here. I mean, I wonder if one of the reasons why this selection of the essential letters is what it is because we have the other volume of Augustine's political writings that Robert Dodaro has edited that includes so many of his letters on political matters and what we could call his activism for matters of social justice. And I think you can see across Augustine's life and across these different contexts, very different moods and postures and sensibilities. So which is to me a big part of seeing his humanity. I think there's times where Augustine is like quite angry and sort of like is tired and done with people. And then you can see other times where he's being very gentle and compassionate. And I love seeing all of it in a way. To me, it's part of the sort of his humanity as a saint that is oddly encouraging.
Greg,
I would agree with that. Oh, no, go ahead. I think you're wanting to transition us, Jim.
No, Sarah, please finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's true that perhaps emails and PDFs are characterized by sort of politeness and necessity. But we do have other forms of communication that can be both sort of playful and variable in their forms of expressiveness, and can also be really, terrible and dark. If you've been on any kind of social media commenting thread, you get really a dark side of of contemporary communication. But I think really, we also have these extraordinary ways of communicating in very consistently in a way that Augustine did not have, right? There's something really lovely but also sort of heartrending in the length of time that these correspondences would take and the arduousness of the journey that the letters would have to traverse. And I think that there's, I guess there is a range. There's a range of things that our modern or current forms of communication allow, both for good and for ill as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Jamie. And now I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And really, thank you both. This was really engaging and thoughtful. And we just want to take a moment as we're finishing up to let you know that we will be sending you a follow-up email. Some of you have asked about being able to see a recording. We will send you the link to this whole discussion that will come in the email, as well as some links to different ways that you can access our different books and maybe some other resources as well. But for now, I just wanted to mention, if you're in the United States, I'm going to talk to our international folks in a second, but if you're in the United States, we have a few different ways that you can access the books. One is just by buying the single copy of the volume that they've been talking about today, the Essential Letters volume. That's available at our website just as the single volume, and you'll find it in all sorts of other places are selling the single volume as well. But you'll also find at our website, they've all mentioned, Sarah and Jamie and Jim have all mentioned the essential collections that we have. We have, in addition to the Essential Letters, which has just come out, we have the Essential Sermons and the Essential Expositions of the Psalms. So these three together are kind of our collection of Augustine essentials. And we have those at the website at a special discount if you get the whole collection. And then some of you may have really felt really energized by this discussion about the letters. And we do have the 4-volume set of the complete letters of Augustine are at our website. They're part of our broader 44 volumes of all of Augustine's works that we're in the process of translating. But this 4-volume set of the letters is available. And if you were to get that 4-volume set, we would include the Essential Letters free of charge with that order. So these are specials that are there at our website. Now, some of you internationally, ordering at our website and paying for shipping might be difficult. So we just wanted to mention that there's a place in the UK in particular is bookdepository.com, which is available and works really throughout Europe. Is a great source. And if you go there and search for Essential Letters, you'll find them there. In Australia is booktopia.com. They have the book as well. And in Canada, our partner there, parasource.com, has all of our Augustine works, including this newest Essential Letters. So those are some places that you can go to explore these further. And then, like I say, we will follow up in our follow-up email with all of this. And then the blog that we mentioned, once the blog goes live, we will be sure to send you an initial email so you're aware of it. And you can pass it on to others and just help us spread the word that this is up and going. And hopefully some of you will be contributors to it as well. But Jim, any last thoughts on your side?
I'm grateful for everybody who tuned in, and I know it's not always easy to follow Zoom presentations much past about 20 minutes. So I do appreciate people's perseverance and attention, and I love working with everybody. Sarah, Jamie, Greg, Matteo. This is a great event. I hope we can do it again. And
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's been great fun.
Thank you.
Thank you all.